This video is part of my construction journal for my leather rolling kit designs. The purpose is to support cooler, more fashionable designs for our homegrown artisan joint rolling workspaces, including Canadian cannabis dispensary professionals, and I am not trying to promote the use of drugs. Since cannabis has been legalized in Canada for several years now, a lot of the negative stigma towards its use has faded. So to be clear, or as clear as a pot smoker can be, to my recollection anyway, smoking cigarettes is still bad, but smoking a joint is kind of socially acceptable, eh? I guess especially if the medical use idea is part of the equation. Adults can now legally consume cannabis responsibly in several different ways, like edibles, pills, or smoking a pipe. But I like to roll a joint and have focused my attention on creating leather roll kits because I have researched the topic for years and have a lot of ideas to discuss, starting with the idea of handmade leather rolling kits for artisan joint rollers as the topic. A joint is a rolled cannabis cigarette that always requires a rolling paper, so a leather sleeve or holder with an opening for the paper to be dispensed easily with one hand is very useful. Why not treat yourself to luxury with a leather rolling pack workstation when you want to roll a joint or several in style? I would think this is a great accent piece for cannabis-friendly hospitality businesses or dispensaries. To determine the measurements to draw the workstation, I took accurate measurements of the rolling papers from a few different brands. They make the same size papers, so 70 millimeter, 79 millimeter, 100 millimeter, and 110 millimeter long, and they all need to fit into the dispenser. The width of the single wide papers is close to the same, with a 1/4 inch hole down the center of the cardboard pack for the papers to pass through. Making the hole 5/16 of an inch allows plenty of space for the papers to poke through, and allowing 1/8 of an inch on either side of the king size pack dimensions gives plenty of room for the pack to be moved into position. Then to make the middle raised and lined layer, I offset the drawing of the adjusted pack dimension frame 1/16 of an inch to stretch the leather around the 1/4 inch raise that the top will mount onto. Then offset 1/16 of an inch to match the other side to create the raised frame. Then finally offset the flat part around the raise 1/4 of an inch for the seam. The rolling paper packs are a little thicker than 1/8 of an inch, but will collapse thinner as the papers are removed, so the raise does not need to be very deep, but creating the shallow frame for the rolling papers to slide along as a guide is an important detail. Another important detail is the workstation's decorative foot base, which uses a 1/4 inch thick 1 inch diameter circle MDF wet mold that was offset 1/16 of an inch for the leather to stretch around. So I made a 3/16 inch acrylic tool guide spacer to fit into the larger 1.5 inch circle punch to make it faster and easier to cut out. But the tool guide can also be used like a regular pattern template and cut around with a knife. Leather of course shifts and moves as it is cut, shaped, and processes are added or applied to the leather surfaces, especially water-based glues. So acrylic glue-up jigs printed from the drawing in 1:1 scale help to apply evenly distributed pressure when clamping to an exact pattern. Everything I do to my project needs to be kept square, so that stretching the leather around a raised liner needs to be controlled to within 1/16 of an inch, so every fine detail needs to be as planned. The top layer work surface and its lining are cut from 2 to 3 ounce vegetable tan strap leather. I do not skive down the edges because I am using a very exact 1/8 of an inch seam in the center of a 1/4 inch raised lining mount, so it is easier to keep the top work surface very flat and square to the pattern. When I glue the top and bottom together, this can be done first, then cut out, but this way works good too, with less trim waste. When the glue has had long enough time to dry and set firm, the 5/16 inch rolling paper window is cut the length between 5/16 inch holes. The acrylic templates can also be used to cut out the window, but the corners on a 5/16 of an inch cutout are difficult to maneuver around. Since the seam is 1/8 of an inch from the edge and line up in the center of a 1/4 inch strip, the stitching holes need to be punched through very accurately along the scribed line. So I like to use a nice heavy set of dividers and make the line deep and easy to see. Anyone that makes things with their hands understands the value of good tools. When using saddle stitching techniques around tight corners and borders to seam leather, it is important to accurately punch the holes. I use 5mm crimson stitching chisels that produce 5mm or 3/16 inch spacing without fail. For corners and curved shapes, the 2-prong chisel is needed, and it's nice to have a few chisels for longer flats. I like to use an assortment of punch pads to protect lined leather pieces from my roughed up work surfaces, as well as protect the edges of the chisels. I am sure everyone will have their own ideas as to what makes an artisan joint maker's workspace special. For me, growing up in the 70s, I have seen the adults using rolling equipment to roll their tobacco on their coffee or dining room tables. At that time, everyone smoked and chose their favorite brands, so smoke shops were everywhere with the fashions that went with them. I have noticed this same trend is happening now in the Canadian cannabis industry. So, in pursuit of modern perfection in an artisanal roll kit brand, a simple handmade one-of-a-kind kit that you will want to use every day is the goal. The added benefits of using high-quality vegetable tan strap leather is its ability to absorb water solvent or eco-friendly dyes evenly. I like to use a small sponge to rub the dye into the leather or use an airbrush. I think the greatest value in using vegetable tan leather is it can last a very long time and develop a very rich and beautiful patina, telling the stories of where your roll kit has been, who you share your roll kit with, like movie stars, mad scientists, political commentators, fellow crafters, bowlers, maybe golfers, certainly ping-pongers, or anyone that likes to play foosball. Cannabis is legalized, so it'll be showing up more often during leisure activities. So what can we do to make a joint rolling workstation blend in and become part of a normal tabletop decor for an average adult pot smoker? Tools I find helpful when I am gluing are a small sponge applicator, a glue eraser, and even though I took the time to make an acrylic jig to shape the raised and lined areas, small modeling tools with smooth rounded shapes help to ensure the leather is stretched tightly around the raised leather to create sharp, pronounced edges and curves without tearing the leather. When designing this workstation, I chose to let the workstation be one-sided, only using the top. Instead of adding another pocket or several underneath the top, I chose to let the workstation rest on feet like any other workbench or table, making dispensing rolling papers its primary and probably its only use. Sure, you can carry the workstation around with you and show off a little bit while holding the bottom with one hand and pulling the rolling papers out with your other hand, but I like to look more professional and use the workstation on a proper, flat, joint rolling table or work surface. When stitching leather, I always start and finish each row of stitching with back stitching to lock the ends of the thread. Like most artisan crafts, the repetitive nature of our work means that we should be concerned about repetitive stress-related injuries. So the height distance of your stitching pony, how you reach for tools, hold and use your tools, how you stand, what you are standing on, and all that are meant to be set to a comfortable position to work. Stitching long straight flats with the holes punched through is fast and easy work for me. A seam that is 10 inches long using 5mm stitching chisels or 5 stitches per inch, it'll take me a little less than 10 minutes, including a minute to thread my needles, a minute to tie off, cut flush, and burn the ends of the nylon thread with a lighter. When I designed this workstation, I chose to close one end and put 4 breaks in the 1/4 inch top liner seam to allow the leather to bend and open wider for the rolling paper packs to fit perfectly. I figured the rolling paper packs need to move in one direction, and of course the packs can be moved along with a finger in the cutout window. So even if you lend the workstation out and the person rolling the joints has more than a few already, or maybe even have become a little stoned, they should be able to figure out how to change the papers when needed. Working with my glue alignment jig, my goal is to line up exactly the top seam with the center of the raised mound and bottom liner without gluing the open end. A 1/4 inch acrylic border cutout template is lightly clamped to the outside edge so the top will fit into it exactly, and using a piece of 1/8 of an inch acrylic about the depth of the pack, and cut to the exterior border size of a king size rolling paper pack to glue around, guarantees the rolling paper packs will fit perfectly after assembly. Since I have chosen to glue around a hard piece of acrylic, the seam edge needs to have pressure along it or it might recoil. For the same reason, I like to leave the clamps on when stitching, removing 1 or 2 at a time as needed to complete the stitching. I use John James number 004 Saddler's harness needles because they are small yet durable, and chose Ritza 0.6mm bonded nylon thread because it is very strong with tight fibers that resist thread catching. This Ritza yellow tiger thread I am using is not cheap, so I do not want to waste it, but my time is also valuable, so I take a full wingspan of thread as a default, not worrying too much if I throw some of the thread away. More than a wingspan would mean I would have to spend more time pulling the thread through the holes, and potentially having the thread dangling and twisting everywhere into knots. So a 5-foot length is about the maximum controllable length, and cutting the thread too short will mean I will have to start another thread with back stitching. So changing a thread also takes time. When stitching through several layers of edge tan saddle leather, it is very important not to rush your movements with your awl because it is easy to cut through the edge or into another stitching hole. Make sure your awl is sharp so you do not have to apply much pressure, and concentrate on where the tip will punch through so you can have your needle ready to replace the retracting awl, which makes it easier to find the hole. Then pull the thread tight to avoid the thread snagging your needle on the next hole. A trick I learned is to pull back on the thread a bit to make sure the thread is free before pulling it through the hole. The needle will move the opposite direction if it is caught in the thread. This 15-inch stitching seam with a transition from stitching through 5 layers of leather with an awl, followed by a 2-layer flat punched already for the opening, took about 20 minutes. The end opening raise for the top to rest on is shaped, but the liner area that was cut out makes it easier to bend and pass the needles around to finish the stitching row. The raised edge is not flat. It is curved around the double thick 3 to 4 ounce raised and shaped leather liner. So all of the details with the liner have to be accurate, flat and square so the edges will line up. Once the glue is applied, the clock starts ticking, so within a very short period of time, the 3/16 inch seam needs to be created before the glue dries, which takes a little practice. One of my favorite tools to help create a complicated seam like this is crimping pliers made for leather work. This set came from Amy Roke. The glue's holding power will be noticed right away, but to ensure the leather does not shift as it is curing, I use small electrical clamps. I did not want to punch stitching holes before gluing because I did not want to weaken the floating edge as it is stretched. So I lightly stitch marked with stitching chisels without going all the way through, using a thick leather punch pad for support. Then punch through one stitch at a time to create a strong, tight, and durable seam with a stitching awl. Having a sharp stitching awl is very important, and since there are no punched grooves for the awl to find and guide with the deeper angle of a punched hole, the angle of the awl is determined by the angle of my wrist. This 16-inch seam took me about 20 minutes to stitch completely with an awl and used 5 feet of thread. Neatsfoot oil is an oil rendered and purified from the shin bones and feet of cattle, and it works well to soften and condition natural vegetable tan saddle leather. It needs to be applied with care. I like to rub a little at a time to the surface with a small sponge applicator. Apply the oil in an even layer, but I do not let the oil pool on the surface and wipe off excess. It is easier to add and impossible to take away and can leave a blotchy finish. So I like to finish with a wax type of a conditioner for a smoother and harder finish. In Canada, cannabis is allowed to be consumed responsibly by adults and easy to buy from a dispensary in a similar way we would go to a liquor store. So growing or buying a few strains and sharing with your friends should be an entertaining experience for the people that like to smoke pot. Like a home bar cart inviting guests to help themselves to a refreshment, cannabis flower and the tools we use to roll a joint can be left out as a hospitality offering too.